Chapter number 17 of The Life of Captain James Cook, the Circumnavigator, by Arthur Kitson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter number 17, 1777 to 1779, Third Voyage continued. In case of separation, Clerke was ordered to cruise for 5 days near where his consort had been last seen, and then to steer for New Albion, so called by Sir Francis Drake, endeavouring to fall in with it about latitude 45 degrees north, and there cruise for 10 days. Then, if his consort was not picked up, to proceed north to the first suitable port and recruit his men, keeping a good lookout for his companion. Then he was to sail on the 1st of April to 56 degrees north, and again cruise about 15 leagues from the coast till the 10th of May, when he was to proceed north and endeavour to find a passage to the Atlantic, according to the Admiralty instructions already in his hands. If unsuccessful, he was to winter in some suitable port of Kamchatka, leaving word with the Commandant of St. Peter and St. Paul Harbour, where he was to be found, and to be at the last named place not later than the 10th of May of the following year. Then, if he had no news of the Resolution, he was to follow out the Admiralty instructions to the best of his ability. The two ships left for Bolabola on the 7th of December, to get an anchor left by de Bougainville, in order to make hatchets for exchange. As the demand had been so great, their stock was running short. They had no difficulty in purchasing it, and it was good enough for their purpose, though not so heavy as they expected. They crossed the line on the 23rd in longitude 203 degrees 15 minutes east, without having seen land since leaving Bolabola. 2 days after they picked up a low island and managed to get some turtle, and also a rather unsatisfactory observation of an eclipse of the sun, the clouds interfering with the view of the commencement. Their position had been settled by other observations, so the ill luck was unimportant. About 300 turtle were obtained, averaging from 90 to 100 pounds each, and as much fish as they could consume during their stay was caught. Coconuts, yams and melons were planted, and the island received the name of Christmas Island. Sandwich Islands. Leaving on the 2nd of January, they did not sight land till the Sandwich Islands were reached, in latitude 21 degrees 12 minutes 30 seconds north. At the second one seen, called Atoi by the natives, they were quickly surrounded by canoes. The occupants, very like the Otaheitans in appearance and language, were armed with stones which they threw overboard as soon as they found they were not likely to be wanted, and though none could be persuaded to come on board the ships, they freely parted with fish for anything they could get in exchange. As the ships sailed on, more canoes came out bringing further supplies, and Cook rejoiced at arriving at a land of plenty, for his stock of turtle was just finished, and he was anxious to save his sea stores. At length some were tempted on board, and were greatly astonished at what they saw, but their wonder did not last long, and stealing soon broke out as usual. When they came to an anchor, Cook landed and found a favourable place for watering, so a party was set to work the next day, and found no difficulty in getting assistance from the islanders, whilst at the same time a brisk trade was carried on in pigs and potatoes. Cook says, "No people could trade with more honesty than these people, never once attempting to cheat us, either ashore or alongside the ship. They seem to have dropped their thieving very quickly." At night a nasty sea got up, and as Cook did not like the position of his ship, He weighed to run a little further out, but the wind suddenly dropping around to the east, he had to set all sail to clear the shore. For a day or two no very satisfactory anchorage could be found, and the weather was rather unsettled, so making one of the chiefs a present of an English sow and boar, and a male and 2 female goats, the ship bore away to the northwards. According to Baron von Humboldt, these islands were discovered by a Spaniard, Gaetano, sailing from Manila to Acapulco in 1542, and it was one of the few discoveries made by the Spaniards during this passage, for they were strictly forbidden to deviate from the track laid down on their charts. The name La Mesa, the table, down on the chart Cook had with him, describes the island, says Burney, but the longitude is several degrees out. It is undoubtedly a fact that Europeans had been at the islands previously to Cook's visit, for at least 2 pieces of iron were found, one being a portion of a broadsword and the other a piece of hoop iron. New Albion. On the 7th of March, New Albion was sighted at a distance of 10 or 12 leagues, and the position of the ship at noon was 44 degrees 33 minutes north, 236 degrees 30 minutes east. Cook's orders were to make the coast about 45 degrees north, so they may be said to have been carried out with fair exactness. Cook says that on the charts he had, a large entrance or strait was represented, and in the account of Martin d'Aguilar's voyage in 1603, mention is made of a large river, near where he struck the coast, but he did not see any signs of either. Proceeding up the coast, the progress was very slow, as the weather was very stormy. On the 22nd of March, they passed the position of the Strait of Juan de Fuch, but again no sign of its existence was seen. On the 29th the style of the coast changed, and high snowy mountains with well-wooded valleys running down to the sea came into view, and at length Hope Bay opened out. Here they came in contact with the first natives they had seen, who put off in their canoes to the ships, showing signs neither of fear nor distrust. At first they appeared mild and inoffensive, and would trade anything they had with them, but when they got used to the ships it turned out that they were adepts at thieving. No piece of iron, brass or copper was safe. Fish hooks were cut from the lines and boats were stripped of their fittings. They sold bladders of oil for the lamps, and it was found that they were often partly filled with water, but this was winked at in order to get on a thoroughly friendly footing, this being a favourable opportunity to put the 2 vessels in order and to give the crews a spell of rest ashore. A good anchorage was sought out and the observatory set up. On the 4th of April, whilst wood and water were being got, the natives, who had given no trouble beyond their stealing, were observed to be arming, and precautions were taken, but the Indians explained that their preparations were made against some of their own countrymen who were on their way to fight them. After a time some canoes made their appearance, and a deputation going out to meet them, a discussion took place, and some sort of agreement was made between the 2 parties, but the newcomers were not allowed to approach the ships nor to join in the trading. The stay here was longer than was intended, for the Resolution's fore and mizzen masts were found to be very defective, and her rigging had got into a very bad state. The foremast was repaired, and the mizzen replaced with a new stick, and when a great deal of work had been done this proved faulty, and a second one had to be cut. New standing rigging was fitted to the mainmast, and a set made from the best of the old for the foremast. When the heaviest part of this work was completed, Cook visited the country about King George's Sound, and was courteously received at a village by the natives, to most of whom he was known. Here he found the women employed making dresses out of bark, in much the same way as that employed by the New Zealanders. Sending some sailors to cut grass for the sheep and goats he had left, the natives made a claim which was at once satisfied. But when the men were ordered to go on cutting, fresh claimants sprung up, till Cook says he thought each blade of grass had a separate owner. When at last the natives found that they could get no more, the cutting was allowed to go on without the slightest further objection. Punch and the Devil. The people are described as being short, with broad flat faces, high cheekbones, swarthy complexions, and no pretensions to good looks. Burney says that it was only after much cleaning that their skins were found to be like our people in England. Cook says they were docile, courteous and good-natured, but liable to fits of passion. I have often seen a man rave and scold for more than half an hour, without anyone taking the least notice of it, nor could anyone of us tell who it was he was abusing. Burney describes their language as harsh, and when in a warm discussion apparently insufficient, and then they had to eke it out with such nods and jumps as reminded one of Punch and the Devil. Their clothing was chiefly made of skins, and a kind of cloth made from fibre or wool and hair, or a mixture of both. In these clothes and a coarse mat and straw hat they would sit in their canoes in the heaviest rain as unconcernedly as if they were in perfect shelter. Their houses of logs and boards, made by splitting large trees, were some as much as 150 feet long by 20 to 30 feet wide, and 6 or 8 feet high. They were divided into 2 compartments, each apparently the property of one family. The roof was of loose planks, which they moved about so as to let the light fall where it was wanted. Cook judged these were only summer residences, and that they had better houses inland. The furniture consisted of a few boxes, some wooden vessels for their food, and a few mat bags. Their cooking was fairly good, but excessively dirty, and their persons and houses filthy as hog-sties. They often had 2 wooden figures in their houses resembling human figures, of which they spoke mysteriously, but as they could have been purchased in every case for a small quantity of old iron or brass, they could not have been much venerated. Their arms were bows and arrows, slings, spears, and a small club of wood or stone, something like the New Zealander patu, and a stone tomahawk, the handle fashioned like a human head, the stone cutting part being a large tongue, and they were decorated with human hair. The defensive armour was a double cloak of hide, usually moose, serviceable against arrows or spears, but they were greatly surprised to see a bullet fired through a cloak folded 4 times. The only vegetables obtained were a few nettles and wild garlic, but Burney says that at the back of the village was a plantation of cherry trees, gooseberries and currants, raspberries and strawberries, but unluckily for us none of them were in season. On the 20th of April, a man who had been allowed to go into Cook's cabin made off with his watch and got away from the ship. Fortunately his canoe was seen alongside the Discovery, and notice being given, a search was made, and the watch found in a box unharmed. Such a loss would have been serious. 2 old-fashioned silver table spoons, supposed to be Spanish, and a pewter wash basin were purchased from the Indians. Resolution leaks. On the 26th of April a start was made, and before leaving, an Indian who had specially attached himself to Cook gave him a valuable beaver skin, and was so pleased with the return present he received that he insisted on Cook taking from him a beaver cloak upon which he had always set great store. In return he was made as happy as a prince by a gift of a new broadsword with a brass hilt. The next day, when well clear of the land, a perfect hurricane arose, and the ship lay to, heading to the south-east. The Resolution sprang a leak, and the water could be seen and heard rushing in, but after some little anxiety, one pump was found to be sufficient to keep the upper hand. The gale lasted 2 days, but on the second they were able to get an observation which gave the position of the ship as 50 degrees 1 minute north, 229 degrees 26 minutes east, about opposite to where the Straits of De Fonte were marked on his chart. They were now able to run along the coast and see and name the most salient points, but time was too valuable to make any halts by the way. The land appeared to be of considerable height, the hills covered with snow, but near the sea well wooded. Mount St. Elias was sighted on the 4th of May, at a distance of 40 leagues, and on the 6th they arrived in the bay in which Behring had anchored, so his name was given to it on the chart. Here the land trended away to the west. The wind was westerly and light, and consequently their progress was very slow. Landing on an island, to try to get a view of the other side from the top of a hill, it was found so steep and thickly wooded that he had to give up the attempt. He therefore left a bottle containing some coins given him by his friend Dr. K, and named the island after him. Here they found a currant and strawberry plants, but the season was too early for fruit. Near Cape Hinchinbrook, Gore went off to an island to shoot, but seeing 2 large canoes containing about 20 Indians, he thought it wiser to return to the ship. He was followed up, but none of the natives would come on board, and after a time intimating they would return next day, retired. 2 men in small canoes did return during the night, but finding that everyone on board was not asleep, beat a hurried retreat. The next day the ships got into a better position, and more Indians turned up, with whom they had little difficulty in entering into trading relations. But as they desired pieces of iron about 10 inches long by 3 wide, and it was rather a scarce article on board, very little, chiefly skins, was purchased. At first only 1 man came on board, and as soon as he saw only 2 or 3 people on the Discovery, he went to the Resolution and brought over some of his friends, who rushed the deck with their knives drawn. However, the crew quickly ran up with their cutlasses ready, so the natives retired, remarking that the white men's knives were longer than theirs. At the Resolution they broke every glass scuttle they could reach with their paddles, says Burney. Cook points out that they must have been quite ignorant of the use of firearms, and concludes by saying, "However, after all these tricks, we had the good fortune to leave them as ignorant as we found them, for they neither heard nor saw a musket fired unless at birds." The leak on the Resolution was attended to, and in places the oakum caulking was found to have disappeared completely. One writer says it was caused by rats, and that the ship was saved by rubbish having choked up the leak. 2 sets of teeth. Bad weather detaining them, Cook had the opportunity of studying the inhabitants. He had with him a description of the Eskimo by Krantz, and found these men to be very similar in appearance, dress, and appliances. They also had the bottom lip slit horizontally, giving them the appearance of having 2 mouths. In these slits pieces of bone were fixed, to which were tied other pieces, forming a great impediment to their speech, and in some cases giving the idea that the wearer had 2 sets of teeth. Some also had pieces of bone, cord, or beads run through the cartilage of the nose, and all had their faces plentifully smeared with black and red paint. After examining an inlet which received the name of Sandwich Sound, they got away, steering to the southwest past Cape Elizabeth, sighted on that princess's birthday, which they hoped would prove the western extremity of the coast, but on getting round, land was reported further on to the west-southwest, and a gale sprang up, forcing them off their course. In 2 days they worked back again, discovering more land behind what they had already seen. This Cook believed to be Cape St. Hermogenes, mentioned by Bering, but his chart was so inaccurate he could not positively identify it, or any other place mentioned on it. Cape Douglas, after the Dean of Windsor, was named and placed at 58 degrees 56 minutes north, 206 degrees 10 minutes east, and the next day a high point in a range was called Mount St. Augustine, after the saint whose day it happened to be. They then worked into an estuary formed by the rivers, one being afterwards named Cook's River, by orders of Lord Sandwich, in order to satisfy some of the officers who thought there might be a possible communication with Hudson's Bay. A good supply of very fine salmon was obtained from natives in the neighbourhood, and Cook formed the opinion that a paying fur trade might be opened up, as the skins offered were of considerable value. Working slowly up the coast, they passed through the islands off Quelpart on the 18th, when the Discovery signalled to speak. A boat was sent and returned with a small box curiously tied up with neatly made twine. It had been delivered on board by an Indian, who first attracted attention by displaying a pair of old plush breeches and a black cloth waistcoat, and when he came on board took off his cap and bowed like a European. The box was found to contain a paper written in Russian, but unfortunately the only things that could be understood were the 2 dates, 1776 and 1778. It was supposed to have been written by a Russian trader, and given to the Indian to place it on board the first ship he met with. On the 20th, in 54 degrees 18 minutes north, 195 degrees 45 minutes east, a volcano throwing out dense smoke was observed, and in the afternoon they received a visit from a man who had evidently been in contact with Europeans, for he was wearing green cloth breeches and a stuff jacket. He took off his cap and bowed as the visitor to the Discovery had done, but unfortunately they were unable to understand his language. On the 26th of June they had a narrow escape during a thick fog, when it was not possible to see anything 100 yards away. Breakers were heard, so the anchors were let go and fortunately held. An hour or so after, the fog lifted, and they found themselves about 3/4 of a mile from a rocky island, having passed between 2 elevated rocks, a place through which, Cook says, I should have ventured on a clear day, for all that they found themselves in such an anchoring place that I could not have chosen better. Anderson dies. On the 27th of June they were off the island of Onalaschka and came across a party of natives who were towing 2 whales they had killed. They were somewhat shy, but had evidently seen ships before, and were more polite than those previously met with. One was upset from his canoe, and Cook took him down into the cabin and provided him with dry clothes. He dressed himself with as much ease as I could have done. His clothes were of bird skins, the feathers inside, and patched in places with silk, and over all he wore a sort of shirt of whale's intestine, which secured round the edge of the hole in which he sat in his canoe, rendering him practically waterproof. Whilst in this neighbourhood they received a second letter in Russian, but having no one on board who could translate, it was returned with some presents to the bearer, who retired bowing his thanks. After some detention from fogs and adverse winds, they got away once more and pushed slowly northwards. On the 3rd of August, Mr. Anderson, the surgeon, who had been ill for some months, died, and Cook, having named an island, cited soon after his death, Anderson's Island, to perpetuate the memory of the deceased, for whom I had a very great regard, appointed Mr. Law to the Resolution and Mr. Samwell to the Discovery as surgeons. On the 9th of August, Cape Prince of Wales, 65 degrees 46 minutes north, 191 degrees 45 minutes east, was sighted, and they believed it to be the most westerly point of North America. They landed on what, from Heydinger's chart, was the eastern end of the island of Alaska, but it soon afterwards was found to have been the eastern extremity of Asia. This chart, says Burney, was found not only to be incorrect but almost unintelligible. The country was very desolate, neither tree nor shrub to be seen, and the inhabitants seemed afraid of their visitors, though not absolutely unfriendly. They were taller and stouter than those on the American side, and their clothing very superior. The ships fell in with the ice blink on the 17th, in 70 degrees 33 minutes north, 197 degrees 41 minutes east, rather earlier than had been expected, and soon afterwards with the ice itself in the shape of a large field, extending as far as the eye could reach from west to east. Here they got a fresh supply of meat in the shape of seahorse, of which animal they killed a good many. The flesh was fishy and indifferent eating, but Cook says anything was preferable to salt meat. They still slowly but steadily pushed north along the American shore, but being hampered by fog and ice, they crossed over to the west side with no better fortune, for on the 26th they found themselves embayed in the field with large quantities of heavy loose ice along the edges. Having sighted Cape North on the 29th of August, Cook decided the season was too far advanced, and that it would be better to proceed to winter quarters, and accordingly ran down the Asiatic coast in search of wood and water, of which he stood in need, but was disappointed, and making over to the other side was fortunate to find a considerable quantity of driftwood, which served his purpose. Before leaving the Straits, Cook remarks, "In justice to Bering's memory, I must say he delineated this coast very well, and fixed the latitude and longitude of the points better than could be expected from the methods he had to go by." Salmon pie. Anchoring in Norton Sound, Cook sent away the boats to explore, and set to work to determine between the correctness of the chart drawn by Stocklin and his own observations, and after a series of no less than 77 sets of observations he was able to show that Stocklin was wrong. It was at this place that he decided to winter in the Sandwich Islands, as a port in Kamchatka would oblige his crews to remain idle for nearly 6 months before further exploration to the north could be undertaken. The course was now set for Samgoonoodha Harbour, but they did not arrive there till the 3rd of October, having met with very heavy weather, in which the Resolution again began to leak badly. On the 8th of September an Indian brought a singular present in the form of a pie made like a loaf, containing some highly seasoned salmon, accompanied by a letter in Russian. In return, Corporal Ledyard of the Marines, an intelligent man, was sent with a few bottles of rum, wine and porter, to obtain further information, and with orders, if he met with any Russians, he was to make them understand that we were English, friends and allies. On the 10th, Ledyard returned, bringing 3 Russian sailors, but as there was no interpreter, there was difficulty in understanding anything thoroughly. One of the newcomers was understood to say he had been out with Bering, but Cook thought he was too young. They appeared to have a great respect for that officer, and Ledyard said he had seen a sloop which he understood was his ship. They stayed on the Resolution all night, and promised to return with a chart of the islands that lay between that place and Kamchatka. It was understood that there were several settlements in the immediate neighbourhood, employing altogether about 400 Russians. Letters to London. On the 14th, Cook and Webber were at an Indian village a short distance from the ships, when they saw a canoe arrive containing 3 men and accompanied by some 20 or 30 single canoes. A tent was rigged up for one of the first 3, a Russian named Ismailoff, the chief trader of the district, whilst the others made shelters of their canoes and grass, and so all were independent of the Indians. Ismailoff invited Cook to join him at his meal, which consisted of dried salmon and berries, and some sort of conversation was carried on by means of signs and figures. Ismailoff proved to be well acquainted with the geography of the district, and pointed out several errors in the modern maps. He said he had been with Lieutenant Lindau's expedition as far north as Chutotskoy Nos, and saw Clerk's Island, but when he could or would not say what else they had done during the 2 years the expedition was out, Cook began to have doubts. He also said the Russians had several times tried to gain a footing on the American shore, but the Indians had driven them off with the loss of 2 or 3 of their leaders. He also spoke of a sledge expedition in 1773 to 3 islands opposite the Kolyma River, which Cook thought might be the one mentioned by Muller. He related that he had sailed in 1771 from a Russian settlement called Bolshetsky in the Kuril Islands to Japan, but the ship was ordered away because they were Christians, so they went to Canton and sailed on a French ship to France, and from thence he went to Petersburg, and was then sent out again. He was quite clear as to his dates, and put them on paper, but as he was perfectly ignorant of any French, not even the names of the commonest articles, though he had been such a long time amongst French people, Cook was again inclined to be sceptical. He stayed all night dining with Clerk, and returned again on the 19th with charts, which he permitted to be copied, and some manuscripts. One chart showed the Asiatic coast as far as 41 degrees north, with the Kuril Islands in Kamchatka, and the second, the more interesting to the English, showed the discoveries made by the Russians to the east of Kamchatka, exclusive of the voyages of Bering and Cherikov. Cook found the longitudes and places were very different from those on the Russian maps, and was afraid the mistake might be carried through, but the latitudes were fairly correct. As far as he could ascertain, the instruments used for the survey had been a theodolite. Before leaving, Ismailoff gave Cook letters for the governor of Kamchatka and the commandant of Petropavlovsk, and Cook, finding he was tolerably well versed in astronomy, gave him a Hadley's octant, and though it was the first one he had seen, he soon made himself acquainted with its uses. A letter to the English Admiralty was also entrusted to him to be forwarded via Petersburg as opportunity might offer. This letter and a chart of the northern coasts was delivered in London the following year. On the 26th of October the 2 ships got away, and in case of separation, Clerk was given his rendezvous, first the Sandwich Islands, and the second Petropavlovsk in the middle of May. On the 28th the Discovery met with a nasty accident during a gale. The fore and main tacks carried away, killing one man and seriously injuring the boatswain and two others. On the 25th of November the islands were sighted, and the customary orders as to the officers appointed to trade with the natives were issued, and no curiosities were to be purchased before the ships had received satisfactory supplies. They first called in at Maui, where the natives soon came out and appeared friendly, and traded with less suspicion than any of the South Sea Islanders they had met with before. Having procured a quantity of sugar cane, Cook ordered it to be used in brewing, as he found a strong decoction of the juice produced a wholesome and palatable beer, and would enable him to save the spirits for colder climates. However, the crews would have none of it, so Cook and his officers made use of it whenever cane was procurable, and gave himself no trouble either to oblige or persuade them to drink it, knowing there was no danger of scurvy so long as we had plenty of other vegetables. But that I might not be disappointed in my views, I gave orders that no grog should be served in either ship. He then goes on to say, every innovation whatever, though ever so much to their advantage, is sure to meet with the highest disapprobation from seamen. Portable soup and sauerkraut were at first both condemned by them as stuff not fit for human beings to eat. Few men have introduced into their ships more novelties in the way of victuals and drink than I have done. Indeed, few men have had the same opportunity or been driven to the same necessity. It has, however, in a great measure been owing to such little innovations that I have always kept my people, generally speaking, free from that dreadful distemper, the scurvy. This extract shows how bitterly Cook felt the stupid ingratitude of his men for the constant care he took of them, and is one of the very few passages in his journals in which he speaks in their disfavour. This, curiously, was erased by some unknown hand. King asserts it must have been done by Gore, as he is certain it was not by either Cook nor Clerke, who took command after Cook's death. Faulty sails. In trying to weather the south-east end of Maui in heavy weather, the leech ropes of the main topsail and two topgallant sails gave way, and the sails were blown to pieces. Cook says neither the cordage, canvas, nor indeed hardly any other stores used in the Navy are equal in quality to those in general use in the merchant service, and he relates how such failures have constantly resulted in infinite trouble, vexation, and loss. He illustrates his complaint by the fact that rigging, blocks, and sails that were purchased with his ship, although they had been 14 months in use, wore longer than any of the things of the same kind put on board new from the King's stores. On the 24th of December they succeeded in getting to windward of the island, but the signal to the Discovery to tack having been omitted, she stood on, and it was some days before she rejoined the company. January 1779 was ushered in with heavy rain, but clearing away before noon they were able to approach to about 5 miles from the shore, where they lay to and traded with the natives. The next 3 days were spent working slowly down the coast and keeping a good lookout for their consort, occasionally stopping to do a little trading with the islanders, some of whom came as much as 15 miles out to them. The chief article of commerce was salt, which was of very good quality. On the 5th of January the southern point of Owaihi was rounded, and they lay off a large village, where they were quickly surrounded by canoes laden with hogs and women. The latter are not held up as patterns of all the virtues. Vegetables seemed to be scarce, and Cook concluded that either the land could not produce him, or the crops had been destroyed by volcanic action, very recent traces of which were to be seen. Wednesday the 6th of January. The next morning the people visited us again, bringing with them the same articles as before. Being near the shore, I sent Mr. Bligh, the master, in a boat to sound the coast, with orders to land and look for fresh water. On his return, he reported that 2 cable lengths from the shore he had no soundings with 160 fathoms of line, that when he landed he found no fresh water, but rainwater lying in holes in the rocks, and that brackish with the spray of the sea, and that the surface of the country was wholly composed of large slags and ashes, here and there partly covered with plants. Between 10 and 11 o'clock we saw the Discovery coming round the south point of the island, and at 1 p.m. she joined us, when Captain Clerke came on board and informed me that he had cruised 4 or 5 days where we were separated, and then plied round the last part of the island, but meeting with unfavourable winds was carried some distance from the coast. He had one of the islanders on board all the time. It was his own choice, nor did not leave them the first opportunity that offered. This was the last entry made by Cook in the journal he was preparing for publication, and is a fair sample of the manner in which the entire journal was written, and certainly does not justify the sneers that have been uttered about bad grammar and spelling, the double negative notwithstanding. In handwriting, spelling, and grammar he can compare well with his press, either in the Navy or in civil life, and many of the examples of bad spelling given have been abbreviations common in the Navy, which his critics did not understand. Karakakoa Bay. On the 17th of January they anchored in Karakakoa Bay, where large numbers of canoes laden with provisions for sale came out. Cook estimates that at one time there were no less than 1,000 round the ship, their occupants entirely unarmed. They soon proved to be adepts at thieving. One man stole the rudder of a boat, so Cook ordered a shot or 2 to be fired over the escaping thief, but as it was not intended that any of the shots should take effect, the Indians seemed rather more surprised than frightened, and the man got away. The lids of the Resolution's coppers were stolen, and the Discovery had her rigging much cut about for the sake of the iron. The decks were so crowded with natives that Burney says it kept a quarter of the crew hard at work to make room for the working of the ship. An insecure position. The last entry made by Cook in his ship's journal, and probably the last words he ever wrote, runs as follows: Sunday 17. Fine pleasant weather and variable faint breezes of wind. In the evening Mr. Bligh returned and reported that he had found a bay in which was good anchorage and fresh water, tolerable easy to come at. Into this bay I resolved to go to refit the ships and take in water. As the night approached, the Indians retired to the shore. A good many, however, desired to sleep on board. Curiosity was not their only motive, at least not with some of them, for the next morning several things were missing, which determined me not to entertain so many another night. At 11 a.m. anchored in the bay which is called by the natives, a blank filled in by another hand, Karakakoa, in 13 fathoms of water over a sandy bottom, and a quarter of a mile from the north-east shore. In this situation the south point of the bay bore south quarter west, and the north point west quarter south, moored with the stream anchor to the northward, unbent the sails and struck yards and topmasts. The ships very much crowded with Indians and surrounded by a multitude of canoes. I have nowhere in the sea seen such a number of people assembled at one place, besides those in the canoes, All the shore of the bay was covered with people, and hundreds were swimming about the ships like shoals of fish. We should have found it difficult to keep them in order had not a chief or servant of Terreeoboo's, named Paria, now and then shown his authority by turning or rather driving them all out of the ship. Among our numerous visitors was a man named Tauaha, who we soon found belonged to the church. He introduced himself with much ceremony, in the course of which he presented me with a small pig, 2 coconuts and a piece of red cloth, which he wrapped around me. In this manner all or most of the chiefs introduced themselves. But this man went further. He brought with him a large hog and a quantity of fruits and roots, all of which he included in the present. In the afternoon I went ashore to view the place accompanied by Tauaha, Paria, Mr. King and others. As soon as we landed, Tauaha took me by the hand and conducted me to a large morai. The other gentlemen with Paria, and 4 or 5 more of the natives followed. Mr. King describes this morai as being about 40 yards long by 20 broad, and about 14 feet high, the top flat, well paved and surrounded by a wooden railing. An old building stood in the centre, from which a stone wall ran to the fence dividing the top into 2 parts. On the landward side were 5 poles upwards of 20 feet high, supporting an irregular kind of scaffold, and on the seaside half were 2 small houses with a covered communication between them. On their arrival, Cook was presented with 2 ugly images wrapped with red cloth, and a sort of hymn was sung. Then they were marched to the scaffolding, where was a table in which lay fruits and vegetables, surmounted by a very much decomposed pig, and in a semicircle round one end of this table were 12 images. Placing Cook near the scaffolding, Koa, as king, and others called Tuaha, took up the pig and holding it towards him made a long speech. Then, dropping the offensive porker, he made signs that the 2 were to climb on to the uncertain scaffolding. This being done, a procession came forward, bearing a live hog and a piece of red cloth. This last article was handed up to Koa, who proceeded to wrap it around Cook, who was clinging to his elevated but not very safe position. The pig was then offered to Cook and a long address chanted. The 2 principal performers then descended and returned to the table. Koa snapped his fingers at the figures and making what appeared to be sarcastic remarks till he came to the centre one, when he prostrated himself and kissed it, requesting Cook to do the same. The party then proceeded to the other part of the morai, and Cook was seated between 2 images with his arms stretched out, one upheld by Koa and the other by King. A cooked pig and other food was then presented with much ceremony, the meat cut up and kava prepared, whilst Koa's assistants chewed some coconut, wrapped it in a cloth, and then rubbed it over Cook's face, head and shoulders and arms. Koa and Paria then pulled pieces of the pig and put them into the mouths of the 2 officers. King says that Paria was a particularly cleanly person, so he did not so much mind this feeding, but Cook, remembering how Koa had handled the putrid hog, was unable to swallow a mouthful, and his reluctance, as may be supposed, was not diminished when the old man, according to his own mode of civility, had chewed it for him. Cook then put an end to further proceedings by distributing some presents to the attendants and returning to the ship. Though the meaning of this ceremony could only be a matter of conjecture, it was very evident that it was intended as a mark of high respect to the person of Captain Cook. The title of Orono given to him, and often quoted as evidence that he had permitted himself to be looked upon as a god by the natives, was also given to one, if not more, of their own chiefs. and Burney says that the marks of honour conferred on him were exactly the same as those conferred on any one of their own superior chieftains. The grotesque description given by some of the missionary writers of the whole population crawling after him on hands and knees as a mark of adoration is utterly untrue, for Mr. King, who was ashore almost the whole time of the ship's stay and was continually with Cook, distinctly says, "The crowd which had collected on the shore retired at our approach, and not a person was to be seen except a few lying prostrate on the ground near the huts of the adjoining village." None of those who were on the voyage and have left any record behind them suggest that Cook was treated in any respect otherwise than as a great chief and a man. A small potato field was placed under tabu, near the Morai, for the purpose of the observatory, and a camp under the command of King was established there. His camp was daily supplied with meat and vegetables, even more than could be consumed, and several canoe loads were sent off to the ships. After inquiry it was found that the whole expense of this food was borne by Koah, and no return whatever was demanded. A royal visit. A tabu was placed on the whole of the bay on the 24th, and trading came to a complete standstill, the reason given being the coming of the king, Terreeoboo. He arrived the next day, and commerce at once revived. He paid a private visit with his wife and children to the Resolution, remaining on board some time, and proved to be the same chief they had seen at the island of Maui. The next day he, accompanied by several important chiefs, all dressed in rich feather cloaks and armed with long spears and daggers, paid a state visit. Koah was also present in a canoe with other priests and 2 large basket-work idols, whose distorted faces were adorned with pearl shell eyes and dog's teeth. He was attended by 2 other canoes, one filled with pigs and vegetables, and these paddled around the ships, the priests singing in a most solemn fashion, and returned to the shore. Cook followed. King turned out the guard and saluted Terreeoboo, and then conducted himself to the tent, where, after seating himself for a few moments, he took off his helmet and cloak and placed them on Cook, at the same time ordering 5 or 6 more of great value to be placed at his feet. Hogs, breadfruit, etc., were then brought in. Cook and Terreeoboo exchanged names as a peculiar mark of friendship, and the ceremony ended by the presentation of the 2 boatloads of provisions by a deputation of priests. One of those present was a nephew of the king, called by the English Maiha, afterwards known to the world as Kamehameha I. As many of the chiefs as the Resolution's pinnace would hold were taken off with the king to the ship, and the latter was duly invested with a white linen shirt and Cook's own sword. During the whole of this performance no canoes excepting those actually engaged were to be seen in the bay, and all the natives remained lying on the ground or in their houses. Clerke, who had been too ill to share in these ceremonies, landed for the first time on the 28th, and though quite unexpected, he received a very handsome present of food, and Terreeoboo paid the Discovery a state call, taking with him presents similar to those given to Cook. In the afternoon he paid a second, private call in a small canoe with 3 paddles, one of which he wielded himself. On this occasion there were no prostrations, but if any native met his chief he simply got out of his way, unless some service was required of him. The ships were running very short of firewood, and as there was none growing less than 1.5 miles off the sea, Mr. King was ordered to try and purchase the fence surrounding the top of the Morai. He hesitated, as he thought that even the bare mention of it might be considered by them, the priests, as a piece of shocking impiety. In this, however, I found myself mistaken. Not the smallest surprise was expressed at the application, and the wood was readily given, even without stipulating for anything in return. He saw the sailors were carrying away the figures as well, and spoke to Koha on the subject, who raised no objection, except with regard to the centre one, which was at once returned. Burney says that 2 launch loads for each ship were obtained, a seasonable supply, as we had been 4 months since we wooded. On the 31st of January, Watman, one of the gunner's crew, and greatly attached to Cook, died and was buried in the Morai. Besant thinks that this had some influence on the minds of the natives, and may have contributed to Cook's death, but as it was done by Terreeoboo's special request, it is difficult to see how the idea can be justified. A large present. Inquiries were several times made as to the date of the departure of the ships, and hints were given that supplies were running short, but at the same time they were informed that if they returned the next breadfruit season, their wants would be again supplied. When the news went forth that they would leave in 2 days, Terreeoboo issued a proclamation for food to be brought in, so that he might make a large present on their departure, and on the appointed day Cook and King were invited to Terreeoboo's residence, where they found all that had been given in exchange to the natives was laid out on the ground, and a short distance away a large quantity of vegetables of all kinds and a herd of pigs, which were handed over on a return present being made. King says that the gift far exceeded anything of the kind we had seen. The camp ashore was then broken up, and a great effort was made to persuade Cook to permit Mr. King to remain, as he had succeeded in making himself a great favourite with all. A house that had been used by the sailmakers was accidentally set on fire, Burney says by the natives looking for a knife lost by one of the sailors, but Besant, who places the fire at a later period, says it was done intentionally in revenge for the sailors having enticed some of the women there, and infers that Gilbert is his authority. But in the extracts he publishes from Gilbert's manuscript there is nothing of the kind, and no one refers to any other fire till after Cook's death. End of chapter 17.